I'm in the glory land way. I'm so thankful that we're here tonight to worship God in the glory land way, to be a part of the way that God established for us. We're truly blessed. And again, that's the point of that, though, is we have a choice as to where we're going to live our life and what we're going to do. And I'm so thankful that you've chosen to be here tonight. But if you'll notice behind me, I have one statement: I will choose tomorrow. I'd like to look at Acts chapter 24. This is something we looked at last week, and I guess I could say last year. But we looked at Felix being taught by Paul concerning the concept of faith. And I would like to read verses 24 and 25 again and expound on something for our lesson tonight that we didn't touch on last week. After some days, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, and he sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Christ Jesus. And as he reasoned about righteousness and self-control and the coming judgment, Felix was alarmed and said, "Go away for the present. When I get an opportunity, I will summon you." Why did Felix put him off? Why did he put it off when he knew he had an accurate knowledge of the way, and so much so that he decided that he would not do anything at that moment? Could be saying, well, I'll choose tomorrow. I immediately thought about Scarlett O'Hara and Gone with the Wind. I won't think about that today. I'll think about that tomorrow. You know, there's another phrase or another saying: don't put off for tomorrow what you can do today. Benjamin Franklin quoted that. You know, there is something about putting something off for tomorrow. I can't even think about it, can't even grasp it right now. I'll think about it tomorrow. And so that's where I want us to focus tonight, this concept of putting off for tomorrow. And actually, Solomon talks about this idea of putting off for tomorrow and not to do it. In Proverbs chapter 3, we're going to look at verse 28, but I like to look at 27. He says, "Do not withhold good from those to whom it is due when it is in your power to do it." And verse 28 shows when it's in your power to do it. "Do not say to your neighbor, 'Go and come again. Tomorrow I will give it,' when you have it with you." And so for the remainder of our lesson tonight, we're going to be looking at a very obscure passage in Exodus chapter 8. We're really going to be going verses 1 through 14. But what's interesting, it's during the second plague that God sends on Egypt because Pharaoh would not let his people go. This concept of "I will choose tomorrow." So if you will, let's turn to Exodus chapter 8. And I want to read verse 1 through 4. It says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Go in to Pharaoh and say to him, Thus says the Lord, let my people go, that they may serve me.'" Keep that in mind. This is the reason that God wants for Pharaoh to let his people go, so that they may come and serve him. Verse 2, "But if you refuse to let them go, behold, I will plague all your country with frogs. The Nile shall swarm with frogs that shall come up into your house and into your bedroom and on your bed and into the houses of your servants and your people and into your ovens and your kneading bowls. The frogs shall come up on you and on your people and on all your servants." Now, we don't know what these frogs were. I actually did some research on frogs, on amphibians in Egypt. But we do know these came out of the water. So they've got to be aquatic, not toads. And so if you think about it, if you've ever been around water where you see bullfrogs, and have you ever caught them or picked them up or held them, they are slimy, they are gross. And they're not something that I would want to have in my bed. They're not something that I would want to have in my kneading bowl. They're not something that I would want to have in my oven. So think about what this is saying. Now, I found it interesting also when we lived in Grayson Valley, in the apartment there, behind us, there was a retention pond. And so there was a little path, and so in the mornings or throughout the afternoon, sometimes we would go walking with the boys, We called it our jungle, mainly kudzu. But we would be going through, and what was interesting, we'd pass the retaining pond, and I remember one time passing it, and the frogs that were in the retaining pond were so loud that Mary and I, we were trying to talk to each other. I could not hear what she was saying. There was an excuse. I had frogs that I literally couldn't hear what she was saying because it was so loud. So I want you to think about this concept. They're also going to be extremely noisy. This is going to be so frustrating. And it's something that has completely permeated their life, that it's infiltrated every nook and cranny within their life. And they can't get away from it. So how does Pharaoh respond to this plague? And again, this is no different than the flies. This is no different than the water turned to blood. Can you imagine? You're thirsty and all you want is a drink, but it's blood. This has caused, these 10 plagues have caused an incredible upheaval of their life. It has ruined their life, but it's also caused them to question a part of their life that they have come to understand as normal. It's challenging their gods, and we'll get into that in just a moment. One of the gods that they served was challenged extremely. In verse 8, then Pharaoh, again, they worshiped Pharaoh as a god. Verse 8, then Pharaoh called Moses and Aaron and said, plead with the Lord to take away the frogs from me and from my people, and I will let the people go to sacrifice to the Lord. So obviously this is just 2 plagues in, and he's saying, plead with the Lord to take away the frogs from me. Get rid of this. I don't want this in my life anymore. And so we see that he's showing a humility coming to Moses, and he's begging, please have your God remove them from me. Doesn't sound like a God, does it? Doesn't sound like someone that should be worshiped, and yet that's what he had grown accustomed to. Well, frogs had changed that custom. So notice verse 9. Moses said to Pharaoh, be pleased to command me when I am to plead for you and for your servants and for your people, that the frogs be cut off from you and your houses and be left only in the Nile. Look at his response. Have you ever noticed his response? Look at the first part of verse 10. So I was recently speaking with a buddy of mine, and he brought this out, and I had never seen it before. It was Austin Johnson. And I'll tell you what, this is so powerful. Look at the first part of verse 10. So what has Moses done? He says, just tell me when. Be pleased to command me when I am to plead for you and for your servants, for your people. So he's saying, you name the time, and I'll plead to God on your behalf, and we'll get rid of these frogs for you. Look at what he says. And he said, tomorrow. Why did Pharaoh say tomorrow? And I'll tell you, this is what Austin Johnson told me. He said, I think he wanted to spend one more night with Kermit. I had to give him the credit, because it was hilarious. I found it riveting, but that's a whole nother pun. Anyway, that was a leap. But anyway, so when it comes to this, why on earth would he choose tomorrow? Well, it must not have been that bad. No, it was horrible. This had completely permeated and infiltrated their entire life to the point that it's in Pharaoh's bed and in the lowest of their society in their bed. This has completely gone, it has scoped their culture. It's changed everything. And this is why he pleads with Moses. Plead to your God to have them removed, yet he says tomorrow. Now again, we would think, well, Pharaoh's he's crazy. But there's a possibility as to why he chose tomorrow. And I believe it comes down to what Felix was doing. And it comes down to maybe even Scarlett O'Hara and that concept. I won't think about this today. I'll think about it tomorrow. Again, this is just an idea. This is just a thought. Again, at the end of the day, we don't know why he chose tomorrow. But I want you to think about, what did frogs represent for the Egyptians? What did frogs represent? They were a god. And in fact, a frog was the god of fertility. And so they worshiped their frogs. Obviously not that many. And this was an irony that there were that many frogs. There's a lot of fertility going on with these frogs. And so therefore, it is no longer something that they wanted to worship. It had actually become something that they disdained and they hated. And obviously they couldn't pray to their frog god. He's going to the God of creation. He's going to the God of Israel to have them removed. And so what's interesting to me is this is a lot like sin. You know, we think that Pharaoh is crazy to put off for tomorrow until we apply it to us. Until it's something that has taken hold of us, being sin. And we hate what it's done to our life. We hate it, but I'll think about it tomorrow. I'll put it off tomorrow. Because it has literally become just too big. And the reason I say that is, well, really the idea of the plagues, the concept of Pharaoh not allowing them to serve God with his children. You and I are the children of God, and sin can do that. Sin will stop us from worshiping God, truly. But sin will also be something that at the beginning it seems like something we would like to do. It wouldn't be a struggle if it wasn't something that seemed a temptation. If it didn't seem like it was something that's what I want to do with my life. Obviously, the Egyptians had gone to a point that they liked frogs. They wanted to worship the frogs. So obviously that was something that they thought was okay until it took over their life. And that is the nature of what sin does. It starts small, but it grows bigger and bigger and multiplies until our life has become consumed. And we're like Pharaoh saying, I'm going to put it off for tomorrow. If you can advance the slide, the clicker is not up here. So I'll choose tomorrow. When we think about this idea, I'll choose tomorrow. Again, we look at Pharaoh and think he's crazy, but when we apply it to sin, he's not so crazy. When we apply it to our own struggles that have become so big, he's not so crazy. And I'm so thankful that Steve mentioned James chapter 1 and verse 17. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. The context to this is verse 14. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. So we think here, what's interesting about sin. Notice there's the conception of sin. Sin is conceived and it actually gives birth. That's why sin and the flesh are one and the same. When it comes to you and I being in the flesh. And so we've got to realize that when something starts with the temptation, oh, that looks like something I'd want to take part in. By the end, it brings forth death, and I don't want any part of it anymore. I mean, that's why you can look at somebody who is the life of a party, when it comes to alcohol, but then you look at what alcohol has done to that person's life, and now they're alcoholic, and it's no longer a party. It's no longer fun. And we live in a world that is very, very gray between when does that begin and when does that end. And the friends that we once had, they will no longer be friends if we go too far with it. The world is full of plagues, the plagues of sin. And again, verse 16 says, do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. And that's the thing. God has given us gifts, but Satan only gives us deception. Satan will be the one that sets the hook, that lures and entices us, even though we are led by our desires away from God. So this idea of sin being conceived, giving birth to sin, this concept of the flesh, I'd like to go to Romans chapter 7. Romans 7, and this is something we looked at recently as well. But I'd like to look at a few more passages from that passage. Verse 15 beginning. Paul talks about the concept of sin. He talks about the concept of the flesh. He says, "For I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing that I hate. Now, if I do what I do not want, I agree with the law that it is good. So now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells within me." Remember, how does sin dwell within you and I? Well, when desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin literally dwells within us because it's conceived. Verse 18, he says, "For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is, in my flesh, for I have the desire to do what is right, but not the ability to carry it out." I immediately think about Pharaoh. He had the desire to get rid of all of the frogs, to get rid of this plague. And he didn't have the ability to carry it out. He was literally powerless. And that was a good thing for Pharaoh to learn. Because this man could do anything, could get anything, could have anything done for him except removing little tiny frogs. Just millions and millions of them. It was good for him to learn the concept of being powerless, and yet he knew the one thing he needed to do. He went to Moses. Obviously, he couldn't go. He went to his magicians. They were able to produce frogs. That's quite incredible. There was something there. They were able to produce them. He hardened his heart. But they weren't able to get rid of them. You know he went to them first. We don't, but it's not said there. But he goes to Moses and pleads and says, "Please plead with your God to have these removed." So we know that he wants them removed. So verse 19 of Romans 7 says, "For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I keep on doing. Now, if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells within me. So I find it to be a law that when I want to do right, evil lies close at hand. For I delight in the law of God in my inner being, but I see in my members another law waging war against the law of my mind and making me captive to the law of sin that dwells in my members. Wretched man that I am." What's interesting about Paul's response to the sin that dwells within him, it causes him to feel wretched. It causes him to say, "I am wretched. This is who I am." And so often sin can become who we are in our minds, in our thinking. We get to a point where we say, "Well, this is just my lot. This is just who I am now. I am literally this person now." It has become so big, it has been conceived, and it is growing so much in my life that I cannot get rid of it. Wretched man that I am. Who will deliver me from this body of death? Again, Pharaoh wanted to be delivered, and he goes to the only God he knows that can do it. And yet, he says, "Tomorrow." Again, we can know the right thing to do, and ironically, the definition to sin that we find in James 4:17, "To him who knows to do good, who knows the right thing to do, and does not do it, to him it is sin." And that's exactly what Pharaoh is doing. He knows that he can just say the word and it's gone. But I'm going to put it off. Again, sin. Wretched man that I am. But I'm so thankful for what Paul said in verse 25. "Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then I myself serve the law of God with my mind, but with my flesh I serve the law of sin." So this shows why Paul relied so heavily on Jesus Christ, relying so much on what Jesus said to get him out of that turmoil. And we've got to realize that God will remove the plague of sin from our lives. He will remove it if we're willing to allow it, if we're willing to choose it. we're willing to choose today. Now, if you will, let's look back at Exodus chapter 8, and let's finish the context. Finish the verse there, specifically in verse 10. He says, and he said tomorrow, Moses said, "Be it as you say, so that you may know that there is no one like the Lord our God. The frogs shall go away from you, and your houses, and your servants, and your people, and they shall be left only in the Nile." It's going to go back to the way that it was. Or is it? You know, I think sometimes we have that mentality, we have that idea that, well, if maybe you heard that when I said God will remove the sin from you. I did not say that everything will go back to the way that it was. It's so easy for us to think that it should, or that we won't be scarred, we won't be hurt by it. But we know that it did not go back to the way that it was. Let's keep reading. So Moses and Aaron, verse 12, went out from Pharaoh, and Moses cried to the Lord about the frogs, as he had agreed with Pharaoh. And the Lord did according to the word of Moses. The frogs died out in the houses. Where were they in the houses? They were in the beds. They were in the bedrooms. They were in the kneading bowls. They were in the ovens. They were in every nook and cranny in the house. And they died. As soon as God was able to create them, He was able to get rid of them. But this was not how Moses wanted. Moses wanted them to vanish just as quickly as they appeared. That didn't happen. They died where they were. Man. So let's keep going. So, let's see. And the Lord did according to the word of Moses, 13. The frogs died out in the houses, the courtyards, and the fields. And they gathered them together in heaps, and the land stank. King James, I love that. Stinketh. I love that. But think about the concept of the result of this. He prays for it to be removed, and it is removed, but the consequences are still there. The stinking is still there. And I think sometimes we feel maybe that it's just going to all go away, it's all going to go back the way it is. And I think that's something as to why when something grows so big in our life, it becomes so large that we just say, this is going to be a mess. This is going to be a mess for me to clean up if I confess to this. If I strive to get rid of it, it's almost easier to keep it going so I don't have to go through the cleanup process. I don't have to go through the counseling. I don't have to go through people knowing. Maybe we see a little bit more of why Pharaoh said tomorrow, because just how big this plague had become. And we've got to realize that's what sin does. It gives birth in our flesh. It's not a coincidence the frog is the god of fertility. Sin gives birth, leads to death. It leads to death. And we're deceived and deceiving ourselves if we think that something can continue to grow in our lives and it'll just take care of itself. I'll just keep sweeping under the rug. Well, you know what? That mound under that rug is going to grow so big that you're going to trip over it. And you can't get rid of it. We've got to realize that we cannot take sin with us into heaven, but we can take it into hell. And this is serious. And it needs to be removed from our lives. God can and will remove it. But eventually that smell went away. And obviously something else took its place. So that's why we have to continue to put our trust in the God of creation, not the gods that this world is conjuring and coming up with. We don't put our trust in anything other than loving the Lord our God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving our neighbor as ourselves. We've got to do this before it's everlastingly too late. Because Will we choose tomorrow? We don't have a guarantee of tomorrow. If you will, turn to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. Let's see, make sure. 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 1. It says, "Now concerning the times and the seasons, brothers, you have no need to have anything written to you. For you yourselves are fully aware that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. While people are saying, 'There's peace and security,' then sudden destruction will come upon them as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. When sin is conceived and it brings forth, it gives birth to death, we don't know when that death is going to come. In the same way, we don't know when labor pains are going to come on. We will not escape." But there are those who are saying, well, there's peace and security. Jesus has not returned in almost 2,000 years. I've got another day. Surely I've got another day. I won't think about that today. I'll think about it tomorrow. And let's not have Scarlett O'Hara coming up with our theology. Life will be gone with the wind. And we don't know when Jesus will return. We don't know the day. We don't know if it will be today. Will you choose an uncertain tomorrow, or will you choose today? If you're subject to the invitation, won't you come while together we stand and while we sing?